Spain's brutal invasion. How Puerto Rico was conquered, enslaved, and reshaped from day one. Listen up. This isn't some fairy tale discovery. The first takeover of Puerto Rico was straight-up military invasion launched by Spain straight out of Hispaniola, the island we now know as Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Here's the raw breakdown. No filter, Spain kicked things off by planting their flag hard on Hispaniola starting in 1492 after Columbus showed up. That spot became their launch pad for spreading terror across the region. Nearby islands didn't stand a chance. By the early 1500s, specifically 1508, Juan Ponce de Leon rolled in from Hispaniola with armed forces. This wasn't neighbors moving in for a friendly chat. It was full-on conquest, armed takeover of an island already home to thriving Taino communities. They claimed land, resources, and people by force. Right after gaining control, the Spanish slammed the Taino into the encomienda system, a fancy name for legalized slavery. Taino men, women, and kids got rounded up and forced into back-breaking work, digging for gold in mines, planting crops, constructing Spanish outposts, and serving the colonizers' every demand. Brutal overwork, savage violence, and waves of European diseases, smallpox, measles, you name it, that the Taino had zero immunity to wiped out massive numbers. Population crashed hard and fast. As Taino numbers tanked from the non-stop abuse and epidemics, the Spanish didn't slow down, they doubled down. Starting as early as 1513, some sources point to even earlier imports, they shipped in enslaved Africans, many first funneled through Hispaniola before hitting Puerto Rico's shores. These were West African people, Wolof, Mandinka, Fula, Bambara, and others, dragged across the Atlantic in chains. For a stretch, Taino survivors and newly arrived enslaved Africans endured the nightmare side by side, chained together in gold mines, forced labor on farms, building forts and settlements under the whip. As Taino communities got devastated beyond recovery, Spanish reliance shifted heavier toward African enslavement to keep the exploitation machine running. Bottom line, straight facts, Spain set up base on Hispaniola first. They launched a violent invasion of Puerto Rico from there. Taino people got enslaved and crushed under encomienda brutality. Enslaved Africans got imported early to replace the dying indigenous workforce. Both groups suffered forced labor together under Spanish domination. This ugly history forged Puerto Rico's roots: indigenous Taino resilience, African strength and survival, Spanish imposition, all mixed through invasion, enslavement, resistance, and survival against impossible odds. No glossing over it. Colonization was theft, genocide, and slavery dressed up as progress. We honor the truth by facing it head-on. Straight talk, no fairy tales, no softening the edges. Puerto Rico didn't just get discovered or gently blended. It was hit by repeated waves of brutal European domination, starting with outright military takeover and stretching across centuries of control, exploitation, and survival. Here's the unfiltered reality, every piece laid bare. First wave, the violent Spanish invasion, early 1500s, Spain didn't tiptoe in. They launched a full military assault on Boracay, the Taino name for the island, straight from their stronghold on Hispaniola. In 1508, Juan Ponce de Leon and his armed men crossed over, weapons ready, and seized control by force. The Taino, who had lived there for centuries in organized communities, farming, fishing, and building a rich culture, faced immediate conquest. This wasn't settlement, it was invasion. Spanish forces crushed resistance, claimed the land, and immediately enslaved the indigenous population under the encomienda system. Taino people, men, women, children, were forced into deadly labor, mining gold until they dropped, growing cash crops, constructing forts and towns, and serving the colonizers. Overwork killed thousands. Violence killed more. Then came the diseases, smallpox, influenza, measles, that the Taino immune systems had never encountered. Within decades, the Taino population was decimated, reduced from hundreds of thousands to a tiny fraction. To keep the profits flowing as Taino numbers collapsed, the Spanish began importing enslaved Africans almost immediately, starting in the 1510s and ramping up fast. Many of those first Africans arrived via Hispaniola before being sent to Puerto Rico. They were ripped from West and Central Africa, chained, shipped across the Atlantic, and thrown into the same mines, fields, and building sites alongside surviving Taino. For a time, indigenous and African people endured forced labor side by side under the same whip. From that first violent takeover, the island's foundation was laid in blood. Taino resilience, African endurance, and Spanish imposition. The mixing began right there, not by choice, but through conquest, rape, coercion, survival strategies, and limited consensual unions in a world of extreme power imbalance. Second wave. Centuries of unbroken European colonial domination, 1500s, 1898, Spain didn't leave. They dug in for nearly 400 years. Puerto Rico remained a Spanish colony until 1898, one of the last pieces of their crumbling empire in the Americas. During those long centuries, waves of Spanish settlers, soldiers, administrators, and opportunists kept arriving. They intermingled, sometimes violently, sometimes through unequal power dynamics, with the remaining Taino-descended people and the growing Afro-descended population. Forced sexual relationships, rape by colonizers, and exploitative unions were widespread realities of colonial life. At the same time, some consensual relationships formed over generations in a society shaped by hierarchy. Children were born from all of it, light-skinned, dark-skinned, every shade in between, creating the complex ancestry so many Puerto Ricans carry today. This wasn't a peaceful multicultural party. It was centuries of colonial rule enforcing racial castes. Slavery, African chattel slavery, expanded massively after the Taino decline, plantation economies, and cultural suppression. Yet through it all, Taino cultural elements survived in language, food, spirituality, and place names. African traditions, music, religion, and resistance strategies fused in, growing stronger. Spanish language, Catholicism, and customs layered on top. The result, a people forged in resistance and adaptation. The full ancestral mix, no cherry-picking allowed. Today's Puerto Rican identity isn't one single origin story. It's this brutal, layered history. Taino, the original stewards of Boracay, whose blood, knowledge, and spirit persist despite near genocide. African, the strength, creativity, and unbreakable will brought by millions enslaved and their descendants. Spanish/European, the colonizers, settlers, and their descendants who imposed rule but also contributed genetically and culturally. Caribbean/Hispaniola connections, constant movement of people, ideas, and survival tactics across islands under shared colonial pressures. Anyone who fixates on only one strand, whether pure indigenous, pure African, or mostly Spanish, is lying to themselves and erasing the full picture. The truth is messier, uglier, and more powerful. Puerto Rico was born from invasion, slavery, genocide, forced mixing, cultural fusion, and fierce survival over 500+ years. In plain, fearless words, Spain invaded and conquered Puerto Rico by force. They enslaved Taino people first, then flooded the island with enslaved Africans. Europeans ruled without interruption for 4 centuries, settling, exploiting, and mixing through every means, coerced and otherwise. Taino and African roots endured and blended with the European presence. That collision, that struggle, that resilience, that's where Puerto Ricans come from. We don't romanticize colonizers. We don't whitewash history. We face it, claim the parts that empower us, and keep pushing for real liberation. Just so that you clearly understand the history. Because they rewrite history so much they keep us confused, isolated, and not knowing what to believe. Black and Puerto Rican roots run deep. We didn't meet in the U.S. We were bound together in Caribbean chains centuries ago. Cut the nonsense. Black folks and Puerto Ricans aren't some recent hookup in mainland America. Our connection kicks off way back in the 1500s, forged in the fire of Spanish invasion, slavery, and survival on Boracay itself. No myths, no dilution. This is the raw history of shared suffering, shared labor, shared resistance, and shared bloodlines that started long before the U.S. was even a concept. When Spain stormed Puerto Rico starting in 1508 with Ponce de Leon's crew, they didn't come to coexist, they came to conquer. The Taino, the island's original people with advanced agriculture, communities, and spiritual systems, got hit hard. Enslaved under the encomienda system, basically state-sanctioned forced labor, Taino were worked to death mining gold, building settlements, farming for the colonizers. European diseases ripped through them like wildfire. No immunity meant massive die-offs. Within a generation or two, the Taino population plummeted from hundreds of thousands to scraps. The Spanish, obsessed with keeping profits rolling, didn't pause. They pivoted fast to importing enslaved Africans to fill the gaps. The first enslaved Africans hit Puerto Rico shores as early as 1513, with some free black conquistadors even arriving alongside Ponce de Leon earlier. But the mass forced migration ramped up quick. West Africans from groups like Wolof, Mandinka, Fula, Bambara, and others from the Bight of Biafra and Lower Guinea regions were dragged across the Atlantic. Many routed through Hispaniola first. These enslaved Africans and surviving Taino didn't live in separate worlds. They were thrown together under the same brutal system, side by side in gold mines, sugar fields once plantations expanded, construction sites, households. They endured the whip, starvation, disease, and dehumanization together. They resisted together. Two runaway communities, Cimarrones or Maroons, formed where escaped Africans and Taino fugitives built alliances, fought back, preserved knowledge, and created new ways to survive. Over generations, that proximity turned into family. Children came from unions, some born of mutual support and love in the face of horror, others forced through rape and coercion by Spanish overlords exploiting power imbalances. Mixing wasn't always gentle. Colonialism weaponized sex and reproduction to control and divide. But the outcome was undeniable. A growing population blending Taino resilience, African strength, and Spanish imposition. Fast forward through centuries of Spanish rule, and that triracial reality solidified. Genetic studies hammer it home. On average, Puerto Ricans today carry roughly 60 to 65% European, mostly Spanish/Iberian, ancestry, 15 to 21% African, primarily West and Central African roots, 10 to 15% Indigenous American Taino, and related Caribbean Indigenous. These numbers shift by region, more African influence in the East like Loiza, a historic Afro-Puerto Rican stronghold. Higher Taino traces in the Southwest, but the mix is island-wide. Afro-Puerto Ricans often show higher African percentages, while self-identified white or mixed folks still carry all three strands. No one escapes the history. It's in the DNA. This isn't abstract trivia. It means Black history and Puerto Rican history aren't parallel tracks that only crossed in New York or Chicago. They intersected in the Caribbean crucible, shared enslavement, shared rebellions like uprisings in the 1500s, 1800s, shared cultural fusions that birthed Bomba y Plena music, Santeria-influenced spirituality, food like mofongo with African roots, and language sprinkled with Taino and African words. Many Puerto Ricans today embody this fusion, carrying African blood from those first enslaved generations, Taino blood from ancestors who survived genocide through adaptation and mixing, and European blood from colonizers who imposed their rule. Some of that blending came from community building and genuine bonds forged in resistance. A lot came from violence, rape, and the ugly power dynamics of empire. Either way, the result is intertwined lineages. We share ancestors, struggles, triumphs, and scars. In brutal simplicity, Black people and Puerto Ricans linked up in the Caribbean under Spanish boots. We labored together in chains. We resisted together. We built families together willingly and unwillingly. Generations later, that shared blood and history flows in millions of us. We didn't meet. In the United States, we were already kin through fire long before. This truth dismantles any clean separation. It honors the oppressed who survived and fused against all odds. It rejects any erasure of African or indigenous roots in favor of a sanitized Spanish story. Our connection is ancient, unbreakable, and demands we recognize it. No romanticizing colonizers, no forgetting the cost. We claim it all. the pain, the power, the persistence. Black and Puerto Rican bloodlines were forged in Caribbean Hellfire, not some late U.S. Meetup, no bullshit, no soft pedaling. Black people and Puerto Ricans didn't cross paths for the first time in New York streets or Chicago neighborhoods. Our roots tangled centuries earlier, right on Boricane soil, under the boot of Spanish colonizers who enslaved, brutalized, and forced both groups into the same nightmare system. Spain invaded Puerto Rico in the early 1500s, 1508 to be exact, when Ponce de Leon and his armed thugs rolled in from Hispaniola and crushed Taino resistance. The Taino, the island's original inhabitants with sophisticated farming, fishing, spiritual practices, and communities, got slammed into encomienda slavery, forced gold mining, farming, construction, domestic service. Overwork, beatings, and European plagues, smallpox wiping out immunity-free populations, decimated them fast, hundreds of thousands reduced to a shadow in decades. The Spanish needed labor to keep extracting wealth, so they didn't wait long. Enslaved Africans started arriving as early as 1513, with the first documented forced transports ramping up soon after the Taino decline. Many came via Hispaniola routes, pulled from West and Central Africa, Wolof, Mandinka, and others chained and shipped across the Atlantic horror. These two oppressed groups weren't kept apart. They were thrown together in the same mines, plantations, sugar exploded later, fields and building projects, same overseers cracking whips, same starvation rations, same diseases ravaging bodies already weakened, same daily terror under Spanish rule. They lived in proximity, barracks, remote areas, runaway hideouts. They worked shoulder to shoulder. They survived by sharing knowledge, foodways, healing practices, resistance tactics. Cimarron communities, maroon settlements, popped up where escaped Africans and Taino fugitives allied, fought back against patrols, preserved languages and traditions, and built new lives over time that shared hell-bred family. Children were born from these unions, some from mutual bonds of solidarity and love amid suffering, others from the ugly reality of colonial rape, coercion, and power abuse, where Spanish men exploited enslaved women of both African and Taino descent. Mixing wasn't always consensual or equal. Colonialism weaponized bodies and reproduction, but it happened relentlessly across generations. The result: a people carrying all three strands, African blood from those dragged in chains and their descendants who endured and innovated. Taino blood from survivors who adapted, resisted, and passed on resilience through maternal lines especially. Studies show over 60% of Puerto Rican mitochondrial DNA, maternal inheritance, is indigenous Taino origin. Spanish/European blood from colonizers who imposed rule, settled, and contributed genetically through force and otherwise. These are averages. Variation is huge. East Coast areas like Loiza show stronger African traces from historic plantation zones. Southwest often higher Taino, self-identified. White Puerto Ricans still carry African and indigenous markers. Afro-Puerto Ricans carry all three too. Maternal lines skew heavily indigenous, Taino women bearing children with European and African men, while paternal lines lean European, colonizer men dominating reproduction. It's a sex-biased, violent history encoded in DNA. This shared origin means our histories aren't separate. We bled together under the same oppressors. We rebelled together, uprisings, escapes, cultural fusions that birthed bomba music, African rhythms plus Taino elements plus Spanish strings. Plena, Santeria/spiritual practices blending Yoruba, Congo, and Taino influences. Foods like mofongo rooted in African plantain traditions with Taino cassava echoes. We carry the blood of the oppressed, Taino survivors and enslaved Africans who fought erasure. And yes, the blood of the oppressors who forced the mixing. That duality is the unvarnished truth of Puerto Rican roots. It doesn't make us less anything. It makes us a testament to survival against genocide, slavery, and empire. Our connection predates America by 400+ years. It started in Caribbean pain, forged in shared struggle, strengthened by resistance, and sealed in family lines. We are linked by history that runs deeper than any border or migration wave. Claim it all, the agony, the alliances, the unbreakable ties. No romanticizing the colonizers who engineered this mess. Just raw respect for the ancestors who endured and blended to keep us here. I love you all, I appreciate every one of you, and I thank you for your time. Stay blessed. Feel free to follow for more words of wisdom and prayers. Feel free to subscribe so that you never miss my posts, and feel free to comment. Love always. Santiago, DC Maria.